Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Do you remember when football players wore stickum? Do you remember when the NBA played defense? Do you remember when Wrigley Field turned on the lights? If so, then this podcast is for you. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together. We're here to discuss iconic sports moments, teams, and athletes from our generation. This is GenX Classic Sports, sports talk for Gen Xers by Gen Xers.
Record right here. All right, so welcome to the show. I don't know what episode number this is going to be. We'll put that in there later. And today's guest is my buddy Jim Ham. We met, Jim, in the mid-'90s at a job together? In the
late 90s, because Y2K happened.
Okay. You got
when
hired.
I was there.
You kind of hired along with the Y2K? Okay. So we worked at the same software company here in Central Arkansas together, and it became pretty apparent that Jim's a big sports fan too. Jim, tell us where you grew up.
All right. Well, I was born in Chicago, and I want to say in the 5th grade, probably, we moved to a suburb, Brookfield, which is fairly close in, near the Eisenhower Expressway, which runs right into downtown, actually runs under the main post office.
Oh.
It was kind of a commuter suburb where there was a Burlington Northern train that ran down into downtown, and which was really cool because before I could drive, me and my buddies could go downtown for a couple bucks.
Oh.
Down and back. It was nowhere near Wrigley Field, so that was another time or place. But
so where would some wild kids go in downtown Chicago, or
usually back in the day, the big movies when they opened up played downtown only.
Right.
So you might wait weeks or months for a movie like Lawrence of Arabia to come to the local theater, which was in LaGrange, which was the closest thing we could walk to. So you go to a movies, and there was a place called Maxwell Street where all these little shops sold stuff that you could bargain with the people. And it was kind of fun to go down there and try to buy cool clothes or whatever.
what do they call that? A bazaar kind of
something
thing?
like that, because it was all different kinds of shops. And I just remember that was a place we used to like to go hang out or, like I said, buy stuff. And the Cubs came in early, probably. My dad was an insurance salesman, and he would go in the office in the mornings and then make calls at night. So a lot of times he was home in the afternoon, get home from school, and what's on TV?
Absolutely.
Jack Brickhouse and the Chicago Cubs way back when. And just my faves from that day would have been Ernie Banks, Glenn Beckert, Don Kessinger, who kind of interesting that I now know he's from Arkansas.
Oh.
And which, by the way, I've now lived in Arkansas longer than I lived in the Chicagoland area.
Interesting.
But also Ron Santo, who I think belatedly got into the Hall of Fame, like right after he died.
So too,
he had diabetes and
right.
And of course Billy Williams.
So could you kind of what years are we talking? Just kind of a range of years when you first kind of remember picking up on that.
When I looked this group up, it was like 64. So probably when I was we didn't have junior high up there. You went through 8th grade and then high school. Probably 7th, 8th grade through high school.
Okay.
When these guys were on the lineup card every year.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the themes that keeps coming up because I've had my childhood buddies on here with me for 2 or 3 episodes now. And one of the things we always notice is that back then there was no free agency in any pro sports. So they locked in on their roster, so to speak, and it didn't change much, maybe 10, 20%. Yeah. I think the rate now is about 40%, it seems like. But you got used to these guys because they were there year after year after year. So it's interesting that these guys will kind of stick in your head for all these years.
Well, and I remember Ernie Banks, hawking cars in the off season or whatever. Yeah. And when I was looking at the roster for, I think this was 65, that name jumped out at me. And do you remember Ernie Broglio?
No, that's not a familiar name for me.
He was part of the trade for the Cardinals. Who was the guy that stole all the bases back in?
Lou Brock.
Lou Brock. It just went right out of my
By the
head.
way, born in El Dorado, Arkansas.
All right.
Lou Brock didn't grow up there, but he was born in El Dorado.
So, again, I played like Little League and never very good, but I love baseball. We used to have more fun playing like Sandlot, where we
absolutely.
We kind of cleared this old field out and had our own thing set up. You play like right field was out because you only had enough guys to cover part of the infield.
Did you
whatever.
do ghost runners? Because we did ghost runners when we played Sandlot. We had to have a ghost man.
Had the grade school I went to was all old brick building, and we would draw a strike zone on the building, tennis ball, and two guys.
Yeah.
And there was a fence with a big basketball court behind it with tall. So it had a rod going through the, so a single rolled all the way to the thing, a double was in the lower half, triple upper, and over was a home run.
That's very similar to us playing what we called wiffle ball. We did play some tennis and stick ball, but we moved into wiffle ball, and it was the same kind of deal. Had a house involved. You could hit it off on the roof and that kind of thing.
Yeah, we had my backyard. There was a fenced yard across from us, so it was wiffle ball home run derby and over the fence.
Well, so I would bet, based on the years that you're giving me and your age, that baseball was still very much the national pastime. Because we've kind of all agreed, even for a purist baseball fan, it's hard to argue that college and pro football haven't sort of wrestled the attention away from most Americans. The numbers
even basketball.
Yeah, the numbers kind of show that. But you're talking about prime national pastime growing up years where baseball was still king. I'm pretty sure. So it sounds like it was for you anyway.
Yeah, for sure. And it was, baseball was it for me. And actually, growing up in Chicago, the other thing was hockey.
Yeah.
In the wintertime, there was no organized hockey, but we used to go to this creek and walk for a mile or two to get there. But yeah, baseball was it for me in the summer and growing up or whatever.
Well, I promise you and I will get back together and talk hockey, because we're not going to have hockey on here in any other way, because none of us dudes down here did that, obviously. But I would love to talk hockey with you on another one, because I'm genuinely very curious about kids that grew up and hockey being such a part of their experience and fandom, because none of us, we're all very curious about that. It seems like a lot of fun to grow up being into hockey and living somewhere where it was a good idea to learn how to ice skate, kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that you really need to see in person, because it looks kind of crazy on TV, but if you're looking at the whole thing, you can kind of see the ebb and flow of it.
When Little Rock had the minor league teams, I went several times. It was fascinating to watch. I had no idea the puck actually was kind of caught up higher than I didn't know it got up off the ice as much as it did till I saw it live and realized that thing's whizzing around at face level a lot out there, and people don't realize that. So we will definitely get back together and talk hockey maybe this winter. I would love to do that. So obviously that would have been the Blackhawks back then. I don't know. I'm not a hockey historian. Were they any good in that era?
Yeah, I don't know if they won the Stanley Cup, because there was only 6 teams. And it was dominated by Montreal.
Wow, 16.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And so
Montreal, yeah, they were.
I know that you could. My dad got tickets to one game, and we were one row in front of standing room. That's how far back we were.
Would that have been old Chicago Stadium, perhaps?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the old one.
Okay.
Where I saw. It would have been the old stadium. Probably the 2 best known players would have been Stan Mikita. And which is
Stan Mikita's Donuts from Wayne's World.
I was just going to say Wayne's World, and Bobby Hull. Was a great. And just one other bit of trivia I don't know if it was from watching TV or whatever, but I shot left-handed. I played left-handed.
Really?
I'm not left-handed.
That's the only thing, sports-wise, or any other thing you don't.
You would think you would power with your arm, but I did, and it must have been
somebody you saw
seen on TV as kind of flipped. Anyway, off subject.
No, all of this counts because we've got an entire episode about the media. So let me ask you that, since you brought it up about TV. obviously you didn't go to a ton of games because it was kind of hard to do that, but whether it was hockey or football or whatever, how did you in that area and at that time, how did you watch your sports? I mean, was WGN the source for? Were there other things that you picked up in the old antenna days? How did that go for you?
Well, again, since my main thing was, football, and I think, if I remember, WGN did hockey games, but I don't think any national channels did it.
Okay.
Baseball, you remember the game of the week?
Absolutely.
It was on like Saturday.
Yeah.
It used to be Tony Kubek and somebody else.
Yeah, we couldn't remember who, but we all talked about, my buddies and I talked about how there was a game of the week, a Saturday afternoon, and we couldn't, ABC or NBC, somebody had a game of the week in Major League Baseball. You never knew who it was going to be, but
yeah.
So there was that, but
WGN broadcast a ton of, even up into the 80s before
Absolutely.
they dropped it, whenever in the 00s, right when they got good.
Yeah.
But I did, again, I know my parents, my dad, we didn't have a lot of money. We weren't poor, but we probably went to 3 or 4 games a year.
Yeah, I mean,
and back then, I know now you see it, it's just totally sold out every time. But he would go to the same guy out in the left field side box office, and we'd get, I guess they're field boxes, say between third and the foul pole on that side.
Yeah.
So decent seats.
Yeah.
And like I said, usually 2 or 3 games a year maybe. Yeah. And then we would go to maybe one White Sox game, so you could go to a night game.
Yeah.
But that's another thing about a real baseball fan in Chicago. You're one or the other.
Well, you just stole my thunder, because I was about to ask you, when you grow up there, how does it come about that you're one or the other? Because you're damn sure not both. So how does that happen? Family influence?
Well,
friends, neighborhood, what?
My dad, obviously. Now, I don't remember where we lived in Chicago, but the Cubs are on the north side.
Right.
And the White Sox are on the south side.
Right.
So I'm sure it's neighbor related as to where you lived.
Yeah, true.
To which games you would go to. And
okay.
I think we commented on before, because there were day games, you'd see the business people there would, they got their neckties off maybe, but they got their white shirts on, and they're coming from the office to go to the game or whatever.
Yeah, their suit jacket slung over their shoulder and hanging on the back of the seat. So what I think I've probably told you this in many rounds of golf and whatever, but we just spent a significant amount of time talking about it on the media episode that we did. How funny or odd is it to you that, let's say 20 years later, a bunch of kids in South Arkansas are watching WGN daily to watch the Cubs play? I mean, that has to be a really weird deal. First of all, it's Cardinals territory, but secondly, that's the power of cable television when that really started going in the 80s. I think we decided we got Cablevision around 81 or 2, which is coincidentally a good segue into the 84 discussion later. But what do you think about it? How odd is that?
Well, and not only the Cubs, but remember the Braves on TBS.
We talked about a lot of both of those, because all of us realized that there was a lot of Cardinals fans around, and our theory is that a lot of people didn't root for the Cubs because they had Cardinals allegiance, but you couldn't watch Cardinals games in South Arkansas. You got the Braves or the Cubs. So if you were a Cardinals fan, you weren't going to just start cheering for the Cubs all of a sudden. You were going to and my grandpa flipped over and started watching the Braves, and he was a huge Dale Murphy fan, if you remember Dale Murphy. And so we've kind of hashed some of that out, but we think it's really odd. And like one of the guys said, well, thank God they didn't beam the Yankees down there. We'd have been Yankees fans, or the Red Sox. It really is weird that it was a Southern team and a Midwest team, but that's who we got. That's the power of cable television.
What did they call it? The Superstation.
The Superstation, yeah.
Funny thing along those lines. When I first moved here, I was living in Mountain Home, which when I first was living there, it was out in the country and we didn't get cable. Used to listen to a lot of Cardinal games on the radio.
And what year was this, by the way, when you moved there?
77, 78.
Okay. All right.
It's right after my son was born in 76.
Yeah.
I've been there a while, and I get a call from one of my old good buddies from back in Brookfield, He's in Heber Springs on a job interview. So I drive up there, down there, from there. And I think there was a skill plant, the saws.
Yeah.
He was a mechanical engineer.
Okay.
Anyway, he told me he had his interview, and one of his first questions was, do you get cable TV here, and do you carry WGN?
That's fandom there, man. That's important stuff, huh?
So, yeah, it's funny. I remember in Mountain Home, I'd sit sometimes outside with my dad and listen to the Cardinals. It was Joe Buck, and who was the other guy? They were really good radio guys,
Yeah.
really good radio announcers. Mike Shannon.
That the way it happened for our forefathers, so to speak, was that a couple of generations above us, they'd sit on the porch at noontime or whatever when they were cooling off from working literally in cotton fields or farming or whatever they were doing, and listen to the Cardinals because for some weird reason that signal reached that far. And so they all talk about, even up till there were night games and stuff later on, listening to Cardinals games. So I'm assuming that's why a lot of them flipped to the Braves. By then you didn't listen to radio anymore. You were watching what you could on TV. So that's probably why a lot of Braves fans came out of that.
Yeah, speaking of Dale Murphy, one of the first dates I took Ann on was I had free tickets to a Cardinals game. And we got up there, and as we were going to our seats somewhere in the outfield, Dale Murphy hit a ball off the center field wall right
at the Busch Stadium, the previous Busch Stadium.
Yeah. So
wow, yeah, he could play. People forget he was like a 30-30 guy, 30 homers, 30 stolen bases. He was quite the player. We've all kind of reminisced on him for a minute or two on here.
When they had their big run where they only won the one World Series course, one of their aces was a former Cub.
Greg
Maddox.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let me ask you, since we're talking in general still, how did the Bears, Chicago Bears football team fit into all this for you? Were you big into that, or?
I honestly didn't get into football until I was in the Army.
Okay.
And some people around me, one guy was a Jets fan, and Namath was still kind of hobbling around at that point. I was in the Army from 68 to 70.
Yeah, so late 60s, yeah.
And another friend of mine was a big, it might have been Oakland, but anyway, I really didn't start watching a lot until then. And by the time they won the Super Bowl, though, I was a Bears fan.
Okay, so when you did sort of kick in with it, you were going for the home team, so the former home team, so to speak, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, they had quite a run there in the mid '80s. They only got the one Super Bowl out of it, but man, they got a lot of Hall of Famers. They had a lot of Hall of Famers on that team.
And another Arkansan, right? Dan Hampton.
Dan Hampton from Jacksonville and a Razorback. So the Cubs were way up there for you. The Bears came along later. Obviously, you weren't going to root for the White Sox. You had the Blackhawks.
Blackhawks.
Now, let me ask you this, because we talk about it. It comes up a lot, and just because of where we grew up. I know you said football wasn't a big deal. So was college football on your radar like at all? Was there any allegiance around you to any teams that among friends, family, anything, or was it just kind of not a thing for you?
Not a thing at all at that time. Okay. Now, it's funny, since I've been in Arkansas, I'm a Razorback fan.
Sure. Yeah.
I pull for the basketball team and the football team. Sort of adopted that, but you still go Bears and Cubs from the old.
Well, and I think that's indicative of maybe the part of the country you were in. I don't know what Illinois' football team was like back then, but just from basic memory, I don't think they were competing at a very high level. Northwestern neither. So, you probably would have had to have gone into, I don't know what other you'd probably had to have been hearing about Michigan and Ohio State, Notre Dame, those kind of schools. I know there's a lot of Notre Dame fans in Chicago, but there probably wasn't a regional allegiance for someone in Chicago to any. I mean, I'm sure there were pockets of Illini and Northwestern fans, but it's probably because of the pull of Major League Baseball still. Plus just kind of where you live. So that kind of makes sense to me, and I kind of expected you to say that. Meanwhile, down here, it was just the opposite. All of us guys were inundated with the University of Texas and Arkansas and Oklahoma when we were kids in the 70s, starting to hear about Barry Switzer's teams, and in the 80s, Jimmy Johnson. So we were kind of, it was different down here because we were kind of the opposite. We didn't have a pro team, and we didn't have any college allegiance to anybody except Arkansas, unless specifically where we grew up. The other half of the town was into LSU, so we kind of, and I kind of knew you were going to say that. I just sort of expected that. One of our my buddies, his dad was a Notre Dame fan, and to this day, he doesn't know why he was a Notre Dame fan. He grew up in Illinois, and David has no idea why his dad was such a Notre Dame fan. He just knows he was because they lived in Virginia. He worked in D.C., born in Illinois, grew up in Virginia, worked in D.C., and was a huge Notre Dame fan. So go figure. You just never know how these things work.
And speaking of that, the whole thing about the Cubs, my dad always said, well, baseball's meant to be played during the day.
Yeah.
But they supposedly had the metalworks, the girders and all that ready to go, and the war broke out.
Yeah. Oh.
And they donated all that stuff
to
the
cause.
wars, and then they just never...
Yeah, I could have gone down another whole rabbit hole on the light situation because there was a lot more there than I thought. There were a lot of political things that happened too because
it's in a neighborhood, and they still play a lot of day games.
That's exactly right. There was a big fear from, say, 45 until 88 that it would completely disrupt things like public transportation and people coming home from work. There were lots of things that went into the decision to keep the lights off the field.
And the thing about the playoffs in 84, that's what the league then really pushed hard back on them to get lights.
Yes.
Because the playoff games were at night.
It was going to quietly be a mess had they hosted the World Series because of not being able to do it at night.
So that really kind of pushed that.
Absolutely.
And what, 4 years
4
later?
years. It sped up tremendously from, and I didn't make notes on it, but I did read up on it. That it kind of got political with broadcasting and the league saying if you're going to host World Series games, because I think they actually threatened them to not be able to host. They'd have to go to Comiskey or somewhere and play.
I remember hearing that,
which
too.
would never go well with anybody, right? Okay, so now, but let's talk a little bit about 1988 and the stadium lights. I remember I was a senior in high school when this happened. Going into my senior year. I remember how big of a national story this was. By now, there was a such thing as ESPN, so this was getting a lot of
it was
publicity.
On the network. I don't know.
Yeah,
ABC
I mean ESPN was promoting. I mean, you were hearing it in ways other than the old 3-channel days, is what I mean. It was in the paper, it was in magazines, it was everywhere, and it was a 3-channel broadcast, network TV somehow. It was August 8th, 1988. They finally got their lights, and boy, it was a big deal. And the crazy thing is it got rained out in the middle of the third inning.
Yeah, that's funny. I think I had one of those false memories.
I think we all did.
That the game never started for some reason, and I just read that recently myself.
I think they call that a Mandela effect. There's thousands of people that thought Mandela died in prison, and they've always carried that memory. It's a false memory. I don't know who coined that phrase, but it's the Mandela effect. And there was a lot of people that I just casually mentioned this to that believe they didn't play at all on the day they were supposed to, or they played the entire game with the rain. You never know. So I actually looked it up because at one point I'm like, I don't know what I believe anymore. So it did. It rained them out in the third, which is not an official game.
What I read too is they finished it the next day, and they did win the game, the first night game in Cub history, if you will.
They were playing the Mets, and they resumed the next night. And so officially in the record book, it'll go down as a win over the Mets on August 9th. They tried to get it in on August 8th, but it was a 6-4 win over the Mets. And as we alluded to earlier, and I didn't dive into this like I could have, but and maybe we will someday, but one of the things I noticed was the reason it did, besides donating the steel and all to the war cause, which was awesome, but Jim said it right. From what I understand, there was a whole big thing about the complete chaos that it would cause sort of that neighborhood in the city if they started playing games at random times. I mean, they were kind of locked in on a lot of 1 o'clock games and whatnot, 1:15, whatever. And so there was I guess you'd say a civil logistical factor that they kind of didn't want to deal with. And Major League Baseball, because of '84, they told them, look, had you made the World Series, it would have sucked to have all those games in the day only, because we were joking about I'm old enough to remember the World Series being played in the daytime some, and guys having transistor radios at school so they could hear who had won a 1 o'clock game or listen to the 1 o'clock game. Now, not a lot, but I do know that was a thing. Maybe they'd play the weekday games during the day, and then on weekends you'd see a lit up game on TV. So
Probably the only World Series I watched live was when I went in the Army in 1968. I went in November under what was called the delayed enlistment. I signed up when I got out of high school. So I was in front of a TV, and it was the Detroit Tigers and the St. Louis Cardinals. The Cardinals had Bob Gibson.
Bob Gibson, yeah.
And here's something you'll never hear again. Detroit had a guy named Denny McLain who won 30 games that year. But the star of the series was a guy named Mickey Lolich, who I think won 2 or 3 games, and you never hear his name or whatever. But I got to watch. They were all-day games. It was like 1968 World Series. And another thing about the lights, and my dad always said, and he always said baseball was meant to be played during the day.
Yeah.
But he said in the long run over a season, it hurts them because they're on this schedule. And then they've got to flip that when they go on the road and play at night. And it just, he said, puts them at some sort of a disadvantage. And I think I could see that,
I was going to tell you, I do remember now that there was a quote somewhere from Rick Sutcliffe who said that, was talking about the heat in Chicago, which I don't think people realize, because it's a cold weather city, I don't think people realize how hot it can get there. And Rick Sutcliffe said that when he would pitch, just typically he'd lose 4 or 5 pounds of sweat. These guys were dialed in even back then. They knew these things. When he pitched in Chicago at 1 o'clock, he said he would lose 8 or 9 pounds per start.
And you know what the other weird thing about Wrigley Field is, where it was situated, and of course it didn't have real high walls. And when depending on the weather, if there was wind coming in from the lake, I remember going to a game. I was in short sleeves in Brookfield, and got to the game and froze my butt off because there was a cold wind coming off of that lake. Yeah, it made a big.
Well, on the broadcast, Harry Carey did a good job of making note of the flags where they were flying, because you never knew. You really never knew. Some of those days, you'd tune in and see the flags and go, "Oh, there's not going to be any home runs today," and sometimes it might be different, but. The stadium's so different now, man. My wife and I took the kids there a few years ago, and right field has this massive TV screen, and just behind the bleachers back there, and it actually looks very modern in there now compared to what you would think they could pull off working with the existing, infrastructure that they have.
That was part of the neighborhood stuff, was what they could do with lights and screens and all that.
It's really funny. It was almost like this what do they call them? POA, property owner. So it's almost like the POA just wouldn't allow it, man. The city knew it was going to be a chaotic situation.
And I still get a kick out of seeing, they just got regular bleachers up on those buildings now across the street. It's just like part of the stadium.
It's part of the deal now, yeah. All of those buildings, whoever was smart enough to figure out to sell those seats, make seats out of them and sell them, back in the day, it'd just be some stray people up there sitting in lawn chairs or whatever. I was going to say,
I could remember people just hanging out. You could see them drinking beer and barbecuing or something,
We used to love watching the games to see if somebody could hit one out on Waveland over the left field wall, because there'd be people just standing in the street out there trying to, catch a ball, a home run ball. Well, Jim, we've gone for an hour, dude, and I'm going to probably split this into 2 episodes. That was awesome, and I appreciate your time, and I mean it when I say I'd like to talk to you about hockey a little bit, because I'm infatuated with kind of anybody that could kind of grow up with hockey as part of their life, as well. So we'll get around to that. And maybe talk some more Cubs.
We can definitely talk more baseball. I'd like to talk about the modern game as an old timer.
Don't even get me started, dude.
That could be a whole other thing.
Let me just say this: back when the Razorbacks this past season were losing in this regional they hosted, they were getting beat by something called small ball.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there with my son, and I'm showing him. I'm saying, this is how we played in the 80s. We bunted people over. We stole bases. We were aggressive. We didn't just hope for home runs to win. And he was like, you're so old. And I'm like, I said, son, when you hear small ball, they mean 70s and 80s style baseball probably. So anyway, thank you, Jim. I'm going to end the episode here.
Thank you for having me, man. I enjoyed it.
Been great, dude. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.